Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in sunny Santa Monica, California, where we are at the RAND Corporation think tank, one of America's leading think tanks, and certainly the leading think tank out here on this part of the world. And we're joined here by Michael Mattock, who is a senior economist here, one of the nation's leading experts on military compensation and personnel matters. Michael, thanks very much for taking time out of your day.
Well, you're most welcome.
So I want to, there's the biggest change in military retirement, in 70 years, went into action on the first of the year. And tell us a little bit about it, because it's a very, very big change, not a tectonic change, but as you said, a highly significant change. Unless you were in the military, you're not paying attention to it. So tell us a little bit about this change. It started more than 10 years ago when Bob Gates, then Defense Secretary, talked about how unjust he thought it was that folks who put 5 or 10 years of service get nothing when they leave, that everybody has to stay until 20 years. The concern was that that would be way too expensive for anybody to do. Full disclosure, RAND was a key part of generating data both for the internal teams but also for the external teams. There were commissions that looked at this. So talk to us about the change and how important it is, how important you think it is.
Well, it really puts the retirement system on a good footing for the future. Basically, the legacy retirement system had 3 major criticisms that were put against it. There were the problem that it was inequitable, in a sense that, say, if you were an Army enlisted man, there was maybe only a 10% chance you would ever see any of your retirement benefit. There was only about a 10% chance that you would ever actually receive any kind of retirement benefit at all. If you were an officer, you had a higher chance, maybe around 35–36% of collecting some retirement benefit. Now, under the new system, known as the blended retirement system, a much larger proportion of people will actually receive some kind of retirement benefit because it has addressed the inequity problem. In addition, there was a criticism that it was inefficient because it really backloaded compensation. So much was put into a very generous retirement benefit and not as much in current pay. And in addition to it being inequitable and inefficient, it was also criticized for being inflexible. That is, it mandated essentially that everybody have pretty much the same career length, and there wasn't really as much flexibility as you would like to have in terms of perhaps adjusting career lengths so that they were made more sense with respect to the way that people's expertise develop and their usefulness throughout their working life. So in the blended retirement system, there are 3 components. Under the legacy system, there was just one component. That was a defined benefit. Now, what the new blended retirement system does is it takes the defined benefit, or 80% of the old defined benefit, and it adds in a defined contribution plan. That's like a 401k plan, for example. And this kind of plan is portable. People start vesting in it within a relatively short period of time, and they collect it. Whereas previously, you would have people who would go and serve maybe 2 tours in Afghanistan or 3 tours in Iraq, and then they'd leave the military and they would have nothing. This way, at least they'll have something. So the way it's set up is that the Department of Defense contributes 1% automatically and then makes matching contributions as the service member increases his contributions, up to a total of, say, 4 or 5%. It's for a total of up to 5% from the Department of Defense.
And it's very similar to what you would have in a large corporation, for example, in terms of what the corporation is matching compared to what you're putting in.
Yes, it's designed to be pretty much parallel to what you see in the Federal Civil Service. In addition to adding in the defined benefit plan, there's also added in a current pay component, which is known as a continuation pay, which is offered somewhere between 8 and 12 years and is set at a minimum of 2.5 months of basic pay, which can be, a nice little bonus to get about mid-career. So with these elements, with, adding in the current compensation, adding in also the defined contribution plan, in addition to the defined benefit, we're able to retain the same type of profile, force profile that we saw under the legacy retirement system. And it also works out that in the out years, it'll end up saving the government about $8 billion a year. So it actually saves money in the out years. Up front, you actually have to spend a little bit more from the point of view of the federal government. From the point of view of the services, what happens is they actually see retirement costs go down because their retirement accrual charge, the retirement is all funded on an accrual basis, the accrual charge actually goes down because the defined benefit goes down, and the additional cost of the TSP is actually less than that of the decrease in the defined benefit. So from the service point of view, or in a service budget, you would actually see it slightly decline due to a dip in the, and over time, as more and more people get into the system, it'll dip further and further in the actual normal cost percentage, which is a factor applied to basic pay to determine the amount the service pays in order to fund the retirement system. This is so the service is cognizant when it brings people in of the, as it were, the burden that it's taking on behalf of the federal government in terms of having to provide for their retirement in future years for those that it retains.
So what impact is this change likely to have on what military careers look like? Is it going to make this more flexible? Are we going to see more people? There's a little bit of a challenge now as everybody waits to get into jobs to retire from. And there are some people who say, well, I would have gotten out a long time ago, but I'm close enough and I'm just going to hang in there for this last 5 years to get my military retirement. Two-part question. How does it change recruiting? How does it change retention? Does it change the quality of retention? Do people now get out at more natural exit points? They may just do 15 years, but they feel like, look, you know what, I don't have to hang in there for the last 5. It's time for me to go. How do you think this changes both bringing people in, but also and keeping them?
Well, I think it will help to bring people in because they can now point to an element of the military compensation system that looks more similar to the civilian side in terms of the retirement benefits. As you probably know, a defined benefit plan, those have become less and less common on the civilian side. You can still find them, but they're increasingly of a minority.
Some would say sadly.
And there are many that are like a blend of a little bit of a defined benefit and a defined contribution plan. Some places have defined benefit plans, but they're closed. They're not taking new people in. That's kind of a minority among private businesses where you find that they are indeed a defined benefit plan and they are taking people in. So it's really something that's on the way out. And the nice thing about a defined contribution plan is you don't have to worry about the fund being funded, as it were, as is a concern for some members of local governments and also, say, teachers in Chicago and in other places that are running into financing problems for the retirement obligations they took on because the funds were underfunded for a number of years. So as a result, it has a lot of advantages going for it, especially in the private sector. As far as government service is concerned, it's useful because it gives people kind of an added benefit in that they have this benefit of freedom of choice, and that if they leave, they don't lose everything. I mean, they lose an appreciable amount by not collecting the retirement, but still they have something. As it is, the defined benefit at 80% of the level it was previously at still exerts a tremendous pull, and indeed, one of the elements and one of the criteria for coming up with this compensation system were that we be able to replicate the current retention curve. So by definition, the plan as designed is a plan that enables the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, and the Marines, both enlisted and officers, to keep their current force profiles if desired. Now, in terms of career links, there's initially this type of flexibility in career links was explored by the Military Compensation and Retirement Modernization Commission, but they eventually decided to go with simply a 20-year system, but it left it open to be explored later. The real innovation they proposed was in terms of mandating a certain minimum level for this continuation pay. And mind you, the minimum level that's the only real constraint on it. There is some language in the legislation that says that they would have to make a case if they went above 12 times the annual basic pay or something like that for compensation. But you can see them varying the continuation pay or other special pays in order to elicit more retention in those career fields where they want to have people, and less for other career fields where, hey, maybe they're not interested really in keeping people around for the long term.
And speaking of keeping people around, punctuating almost on track, I was going to go to the Air Force pilot question, and we have a light airplane, evidently with a pilot in it, still at this point flying over us. So speaking, I mean, that's one of the issues that you've looked at. The Air Force has really been struggling over the last few years with pilot retention.
And that's correct. And the Air Force was actually way ahead of the issue. They knew that this problem was coming down the pike. They could see it based on what they knew of the age of the inventory of pilots in the commercial world. They knew that something was afoot, and they knew that they would be likely to see something like they saw in the 90s, like they saw back in the 70s, I believe, where you have a cohort of pilots aging out of the system who under FAA regs are no longer eligible to fly these craft, and who themselves might decide, hey, I have enough for retirement, it's enough of doing this kind of work, and retiring. So they knew that there was a potential draw from the civilian world, and also that they'd been in a bit of a paradise, as it were, for them in terms of retention, in that during the entire period of the aughts, during the airline consolidation and reorganization, there were times when hiring was so low that could barely be measured. There was one year for which, believe it or not, among the major airlines, only 35 pilots were hired. That's 35 pilots in the entire U.S. Now, admittedly, Qatar Airways was still hiring at that time, but for the moment, normally we just look at the U.S. market.
Well, the Air Force Chief of Staff, David Goldfein, has talked about this. He's met with airlines. Senior Air Force leaders have met with the airlines. He's met with the airlines. There was a discussion about let's give him more money. Then he concluded, and the chief said, this isn't a money issue. This is a rewarding issue. Talk to us a little bit about the complex nature of the problem, because you have airlines that are now hiring and can't get their hands on as many good pilots as they need for their franchises. Talk to us a little bit about the nature of the challenge for the Air Force and how the Air Force is going to stem this when you look at commercial air traffic growth is going to continue to grow, and airlines are going to continue to have a very, very big demand for pilots to fly these airplanes they're buying.
Well, the main driver is actually, and it's kind of interesting, even though the number of ton miles and the number of passenger miles have increased markedly over the past 10 to 15 years, there's been very little increase in the number of actual pilots that have been used. And as a result, pilot hiring was in a bit of a lull until recently, when it's been going gangbusters. And part of that reason is that airlines learned how to be much more efficient. They were really exploiting information resources. So you may remember back in the salad days of the 1970s, getting on a plane and it being half empty. Okay, and you'd have a nice three seats on which to move up the armrests, and you could lie down and take a nap. And that's no more the case. Typically, these planes are up there nearly 90% full on most of the regular flights, and that's in large part due to the kind of information technology revolution. And similarly for ton miles as well. They've learned how to use and route planes much more efficiently than they used to. Okay, we're hitting the limits of that, and yes, indeed, there does seem to be a secular demand trend in both passenger miles and ton miles that will be going on from now into the future. But really what the main driver is at this point is one of demographics. When you have the existing pilot stock kind of aging out of the airplanes, they've got to replace them, and maybe some in addition, just to deal with growth. So for a while there, while the average over the kind of 10 years preceding the current hire was maybe 1,700, maybe so not a huge amount. And so it wasn't necessarily the case that an Air Force officer could look out there and find a good match to like a location that he wanted to be based in, or an airline that he wanted to be affiliated with. Now it's gone up to 2 or 3 times that level. Some people are now claiming it's grown substantially, and a good long-term average to think in terms of would be like 3,200, 3,600 per year for the foreseeable future. It's getting pretty dicey, and it's going to be for at least the next, say, 7 to 9 years, as far as we can see. But then it's going to drop off, because you'll fill in this demographic valley, and then suddenly everything will be okay. Meanwhile, the Air Force has been going to Congress and saying to them for the past 3 to 4 years, winter is coming, winter is coming, winter is coming. And guess what? It's here, guys. It's arrived. It's here. And over the past few years, we've seen this massive decrease in the number of pilots retained after they complete their service obligation associated with going to undergraduate pilot training.
Right.
So unfortunately, as they say in the Air Force, the 3 most useless things in the world are kind of runway behind you, altitude above you, and fuel that's on the ground. Unfortunately, we can't do much about those pilots who've already left, other than perhaps attract them to reserve careers. But what we can do is we can change the retention pay. Now, one of the things that Congress has seen fit to do is to increase the ceiling, raise the ceiling on aviator retention pay. But they have concerns that it not be spread around willy-nilly, that is regardless of actual need within the Air Force. So they are requiring that the Air Force show that they have a plan and they're going to appropriately disperse it. Now, mind you, even though they have raised that cap by $10,000, that's not nearly enough. Now, it started off at this level, about $25,000 a year, over 10 years ago, okay? And that's nominal dollars. It hasn't increased with inflation or anything like that. Right. Meanwhile, regular military compensation has increased by 36% or more. Wow. Where regular military, it's quite substantial.
That is a very, very, so, but part of, you're talking about the pay part of it, right? And so presumably it would be good to raise, make a proportionate raise to that, right? It's not still the same $25,000, which buys less today than it did 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. But what are, when the chief has said, well, this is not just about money, but also making more rewarding career. Talk to us a little bit about that element of it, because, as in the cyber career field, when we spoke to Jenny Wenger, that community prizes continued education, for example, and continued training. Talk to us about some of the other pieces that go into this, certainly the financial component, but then also the other bits and pieces that can go into this to try to attract, as you said, attract people back come back to the reserves, but also not leave the Air Force in the first place.
That's correct. The only reason that I emphasize the money aspect is because something that we can actually have data on. We don't have data on all these other aspects, although I am looking into the possibility of measuring the actual flying hours to see if people also stick around because they can fly, do the intrinsic rewards of flying. And money is kind of useful in that nobody in the Air Force is flying for money. But, at the margin, if they're making a decision between staying and leaving, a little bit extra money always helps, okay? So
The economist said.
yeah, no, I mean it helps. It's on the margin. I mean it's not going to make you change your career radically probably, but you're thinking, gosh, and you're always trying to appeal to that marginal person. Of course, there are plenty of people who would fly for free. There are even people in the Air Force probably who would pay for the privilege to fly some of that hardware. But we need to worry about attracting the marginal person. And the fact is that it costs so much to train somebody to fly a fighter aircraft, okay? Or any of the other aircraft that are in the inventory. Basically, once you get up to a particular level, you put so much money into these people to just get them through undergraduate pilot training and then integrated with the force and absorbed so that they've accumulated maybe 500 flying hours so that they're sufficiently experienced in their aircraft and the weapon systems to do their job. We're talking millions and millions of dollars, okay? And so when you're thinking of it in those terms, the amount of money to be paid in aviation retention bonuses just doesn't seem like much in terms of cost-benefit analysis. Now, in terms of other aspects that would keep people, make them more attracted with putting up with the Air Force, say, as opposed to going out into a commercial pilot world and putting up with being a commercial pilot. Not that by any means all people who leave the Air Force as pilots become pilots in their civilian life, but
That's right.
Nevertheless, one of the elements that often gets mentioned to me is, sometimes less than affectionately referred to as queep, or a kind of administrivia, bureaucraties, things that they have to do, administrative tasks that are not associated with flying. So kerfuffle, that essentially friction in the job that people have to put up with. That's one thing.
Which some senior leaders have said, all right, baloney, I had to put up with it. Every pilot's had to put up with it. You guys are going to put up with it, and we're not going to let you prima donna your way completely out of your ancillary squadron duties.
Fair enough, but one should certainly explore the possibilities in which the ways in which one could make the working environment more pleasant. And I know that there are teams that at the Pentagon are, have heard the message loud and clear from Congress that they are not going to be content to hear, let's throw more money at them. You always want to throw more money at them. There have got to be other things that can change as well at the margin. But to bear in mind, many of the changes that they're looking at are things that in themselves will also cost money. And, then the question comes about, well, does it make more sense to compensate a person with something in kind versus in cash? But there are various considerations. The fact is that the Air Force has to have a certain number of pilots out there trained to fly, not because they will always be flying, but so that they can capably fill those staff positions that call for knowledge of how aircraft actually work in the field when they are being used. So they can make realistic calls about, gee, is this plan viable? Is this plan not viable? Is this particular procurement plan a good idea? Is it not a good idea? What really matters here? And nothing quite helps you do that like the personal experience. Now, admittedly, in the civilian world, there are a lot of executives in major airlines like, United and so on, who manage large airlines without having flying experience. And they seem to do things fairly well. But I think a cogent argument can be made that for certain strategic and tactical decisions that there really is nothing that substitutes for actual experience as a pilot in those cases. So the question for the Air Force is to try and figure out what are those critical staff positions, because to be honest, a lot of the demand for pilots is driven by the need for mid-career and senior officers who will fill staff jobs. And that's been to a bit of disadvantages in the Air Force as a whole, because people are so eager, well, feel the need so dearly to fill those staff jobs that they get taken out of the cockpit just as they're developing some more valuable experience. You know, hurry people through training, hurry people through the unit stuff, and it's like, oh, thank God, we can finally put you in a staff job. And you think maybe it'd be better to get them even more developed as pilots.
And this conversation has happened in the Air Force before, that having a warrant officer in the United States Army, the vast majority of helicopter pilots, for example, are warrant officers. They have very limited squadron duties, but they do a lot of flying. They don't go and do staff tours. They very rarely end up doing something in the Pentagon or another level, but they are extremely expert pilots, and that's the bulk of their job.
Yeah, I've heard of some pilots like Chuck Yeager. I think he was a pretty good pilot. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I do not think he had a college education. As a matter of fact, he at first couldn't get into the Army Air Force because he didn't meet the educational qualifications.
Yes, but he was on a career path, and he was a captain at the time he broke the sound barrier, and he retired as a brigadier general. So he was more on an officer track. But do you think a warrant officer track might be something, sort of an Army model where folks who come in who don't want to have those added obligations and responsibilities focus on just flying these airplanes, and then they become sort of an experienced cadre of pilots, and that's what they do. They fly.
No, the fundamental problem with the idea of having a set of warrant officers is, again, you need to maintain a certain cadre of commissioned officers who are trained as pilots so they can fill critical senior level staff jobs that call for the knowledge of what it means to be a pilot and actually operate these particular platforms. Now, it's the Air Force's call as to how many you need. But yes, there is a possibility that you could have either, say, warrant officers or officers who volunteer that they would prefer to be, say, on a, as it were, a flying or technical track. The main attraction of warrant officers, as I understand it, is, well, it's hard to see for anything but personnel cost reasons. It's certainly not being put out there to address any problem in attracting people to the pilot career field, because the Air Force already has more people who want to be pilots than there are slots available. So really what it would be a way of doing it with personnel who are less expensive. But when you actually look at the personnel costs, okay, they aren't that much less than an officer. We're talking about a savings of perhaps 25%, roughly, okay, in terms of regular military compensation. So not a huge savings, and again, it's not the personnel costs that end up dominating this particular question. It's the training costs. Okay, you're telling me that you're talking about doing a big change or bringing in warrant officers, and if you think of like the undiscounted value of 20 years, that who knows, maybe that'd be a savings of about, I don't know, a few $100,000 versus the, several $1,000,000 it costs to train someone to fly a fighter plane.
Just give them more money is basically what you're saying, and try to solve the problem.
It's, if there's any kind of difference in retention that doesn't work in the favor of warrant officers or anything like that, arguably warrant officers would be perhaps more vulnerable to certain fluctuations in the marketplace due to the fact that um, wow, this new civilian career is open to them, that they can go off and perhaps be a commercial pilot.
Now tell us, you also have thought through one other element of this, which is the reserves and how folks can say, for example, do a stint in active duty, but sort of be incentivized to go into the reserve, serve there. Talk to us about that element of the plan that you've thought through.
Well, one idea that was brought to us by the some people in the Army was to look at the feasibility of a system where we had a retirement benefit for reservists that they could immediately collect upon retirement. That is, if they decide that they've done enough active, done enough reserve duty, and they don't want to serve anymore and want to collect retirement, that they could do so. There was a gentleman in the Army who asked us to look at the possibility of a reserve retirement system that would vest immediately, so that a person would be able to collect as soon as they left the reserve. So we looked at this idea, and the idea, broadly speaking, is to give retirement compensation in proportion to the amount of time that people spent in service in both the reserve and on the active side. So it's a nice, simple, linear trade-off between the two. And the advantage of that particular system is that people would receive full credit for the time that they served in the active. It would be proportionate to what they would get under the current retirement system. But when they serve in the reserve, they would also have an incentive then to serve in the reserve system, and then be able to leave the reserve system once they fulfilled their minimum required time within the reserve, as well as meeting their 20 good years of service, and immediately begin to collect a retirement benefit. Now, this has two benefits associated with it. One is that, well, it works and supports what is arguably a retirement system that is more equitable between the reserves and the active elements of the force, in that the reserve retirement is now much more similar to the active retirement. The second element is that it actually ends up saving money. It means that people who are in their 15th, 16th, 17th, or 18th year of service could leave active duty if, say, something happened that meant that they maybe had to stay home and spend time taking care of their spouse, or some other life opportunities came their way. They could leave and it would not be a complete disaster. Now, mind you, active retention is pretty much retained. There's some slight rounding off towards the 17th, 18th, and 19th year of service, but commensurate with that, there is more participation within the reserves. The net effect is that you're able to actually sustain retention at the same level that you have now, or better, and save money. We calculated to the tune of about $800 million a year. That's $800 million per year. That's $8 billion over 10 years. That's enough to get you a fairly big chunk of an aircraft carrier.
Or a lot of tanks, or buy back some troop strength. Now, we were just in your office, which was very, very cool, and we share an interest both in Japanese monsters as well as spacecraft. But on your desk, you have a Faber-Castell pocket slide rule. And so why do you have it? Because if it's sitting on your desk, you probably occasionally use it, is my bet. Why is it that you think it is a superior tool than your average calculator?
Well, if there's an EMP, I'm all set to go.
That's right, because when there's a nuclear attack, you never know if you still have to do some form of econometric calculations.
Or some other calculations. The Defense Nuclear Agency used to give out a set of circular slide rules. I'm not sure how many were in the set, maybe around 12 or 14, that allowed you to calculate things like, the circular area of probability for a bomb actually landing and things like that. Other vital types of calculations that you might need to make in the event of a nuclear attack, and having been through an EMP, but still needing to know how to calculate these various things. They also then later came out with a little cartridge that worked in the old HP 41C calculator of fond memory, and I'm sure they have now an iPhone app that does all the same things. But it's lovely to know that those slide rules are always around just in case the pedal goes to the metal.
Michael, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Michael Mattock here, senior economist at the RAND Corporation think tank in sunny Santa Monica. Look forward to continuing to talk to you about all matters retirement and personnel policy.
Okay, thank you very much.